Welcome back, friends. Tonight we're diving into the unknown, a world where ordinary lives collide with the eerie and the unexplainable slips into view. As you listen, remember that sometimes a single photograph or a fleeting shadow holds more than just an image. It holds secrets, mysteries, and perhaps even a haunting. If you're ready to face these chilling tales, hit subscribe and give us a like. It really does help the channel grow and ensures you don't miss what's lurking in the next story. So get comfortable and let's begin. The fast lane. I took a job as a truck driver a few years back, hauling supplies along the interstate highways stretching through Nevada. My route often took me down the lonely highways near Reno, with long stretches of barren desert on either side. It was usually quiet with barely any traffic, just me, my truck, and the road. One night I was driving a late shift, my rig cutting through the desert darkness with only the distant glow of Reno's city lights on the horizon. I was on a two-lane highway with no cars around when I saw a vehicle flash its high beams behind me. I checked my mirrors. A white pickup truck was coming up fast. I moved to the side, expecting it to pass, but it stayed behind me, flashing its lights like it wanted me to pull over. It was odd. I wasn't speeding, and I hadn't seen any other cars for miles. Curious and slightly annoyed, I slowed down, letting it come alongside me. The truck's passenger window was rolled down, and I caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in his 30s looking frantic. He was shouting, waving his hand at me to stop. I couldn't hear him over the engine, but his expression made my skin crawl. It wasn't anger or road rage, it was fear. He sped ahead of me and pulled over, stopping on the side of the road. Against my better judgment, I decided to pull over too. Maybe he needed help, though I wasn't keen on stepping out in the middle of nowhere. I parked a few yards behind him and rolled down my window. The man jumped out of his truck and ran toward me, looking around as if someone were after him. "You need to go back," he yelled, his voice breaking. "You don't know what's out here." I frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Turn around and get off this road," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "There's something that follows anyone who drives this stretch at night." I'd heard plenty of trucker legends, but this guy looked dead serious. Before I could say anything, he backed away, his face pale. "Just don't stop no matter what," he whispered, then bolted back to his truck, tires screeching as he sped off into the night. I sat there for a moment, the silence pressing in. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but another part, a deeper instinct, felt uneasy. The desert around me seemed darker, the air heavier. With a shiver, I decided it was best not to linger. I got back on the road, keeping my eyes on the stretch ahead. Not long after, I noticed my radio had gone to static. I fiddled with the dial, but it was like every station had been wiped clean. Then my headlights dimmed, flickering just enough to make me grip the wheel a little tighter. That's when I saw something up ahead, a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road. I braked hard, my tires screeching as I tried to slow down without swerving. As I came to a stop, the figure vanished, like it had never been there at all. I was rattled, but I forced myself to keep going, telling myself it was a trick of the light, maybe exhaustion. I checked the clock. It was only a little past midnight, and I still had hours of driving left. I pressed on, determined to shake off the strange encounter. But after a few miles, I saw it again, this time closer. A tall, dark shape in the middle of the road, just standing there like it was waiting for me. I couldn't make out any features, just a silhouette against the darkness. I didn't stop. I gritted my teeth and kept driving, swerving slightly to avoid it. As I passed, I felt a chill run through me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The figure appeared again, just a few miles down the road. No matter how far I drove, it was always there, waiting. Each time I tried to ignore it, but the encounters left me feeling more and more unsettled. I realized this was what the man in the truck had been talking about. At this point, I was driving well over the speed limit, desperate to reach the city lights up ahead. But then my truck began to sputter, the engine straining like it was being held back. My foot pressed down on the gas pedal, but my speed kept dropping. Panic gripped me as I checked my mirrors. half expecting to see the figure standing directly behind my truck. But the road was empty, silent. Then, in the faint glow of my taillights, I saw it. A shadow darting along the side of the road, keeping pace with me. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence, dark and cold, pressing in around me. Just when I thought my truck would stall out completely, I reached a populated stretch with gas stations and convenience stores lining the road. The lights were bright and reassuring, and as soon as I crossed into the city, my truck roared back to life, the engine purring as if nothing had happened. I pulled into a truck stop, breathing heavily, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't want to stay long. I was afraid of whatever I'd left behind on that road. But as I climbed out to stretch my legs, I noticed another driver watching me. A tall man in a denim jacket, his face lined with exhaustion. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his tone grim. I didn't answer, but my expression must have been enough. He nodded. "It's been haunting that stretch of road for years. No one knows what it is, but it only appears at night, only to those driving alone." He paused, glancing toward the highway. "Once it's seen you, it's hard to shake. You'll feel it following you every time you pass that stretch." I left Reno that night, sticking to the main highways, taking the longest route possible to avoid that cursed road. But even now, I feel its presence whenever I drive at night. That shadow lurking just out of sight, waiting. The man with no shadow. I'd been working as a night security guard at an office building in downtown Portland for a few months. It was an easy job for a decent paycheck, and most nights were uneventful. The building was old, with creaky floors, dim hallways, and a slightly musty smell that you got used to after a while. I'd come to know every corner and stairwell by heart. The place was almost calming in its silence. One night, things changed. It was just after midnight when I saw him. The building was empty except for me, yet, as I was making my rounds on the third floor, I spotted a man at the end of the hallway, standing perfectly still. He was wearing a dark coat, hands tucked into his pockets, head slightly tilted as if he were listening for something. "Excuse me, sir, the building is closed," I called out, my voice echoing down the long hallway. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I told myself he was probably just a lost tenant or someone who'd wandered in. I took a few steps forward, calling out again, but he turned and began walking toward the stairwell, his steps slow and deliberate. I followed, but as I reached the end of the hall, he'd already disappeared around the corner. When I rounded the corner, he was gone. I scanned the stairwell, listening for footsteps, but there was only silence. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined him. It didn't make sense how he disappeared so quickly. Later, as I reviewed the security footage, I saw him again. The camera caught a clear shot of him entering the hallway. Tall, dark coat, head slightly tilted. But something was wrong. He didn't have a shadow. I watched as he walked down the hallway, his form clear and sharp. But there was no shadow trailing behind him. No sign that he was even connected to the floor. I rewound the footage, checked for glitches, but it was all there. Every detail, except his shadow. My skin prickled as I watched him disappear around the corner, the screen flickering slightly as he left the frame. Over the next few nights, I kept an eye out, half expecting to see him again. And every time I was alone in those dim hallways, I could feel his presence, like he was just out of sight, watching. Even though I hadn't seen him again in person, I felt on edge every time I reached the third floor. The hallways felt colder, like there was a draft, even though the rest of the building was always warm at night. Then about a week later, one of the other guards mentioned seeing the shadowless man on the security feed. He was trying to laugh it off, calling it a glitch in the camera, but I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. "What did he look like?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my palms were sweating. "Tall, wearing a coat kind of off," he said, looking away. "No shadow, though. The guy just appeared like he came out of nowhere." I nodded, feeling a pit form in my stomach. "Yeah, I saw him too." The other guard looked at me, his face paling. "You think he's a trespasser?" Or someone who's maybe living in the building? I didn't answer. Deep down, I had a gnawing feeling that he was something else. Something I couldn't quite explain. But I avoided the third floor as much as I could after that, sticking to my rounds on the lower levels, though I still felt him, his silent presence lurking. One night, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to head up to the third floor, determined to confront whatever haunted this place. I told myself that if I could just see him up close, it would explain everything. Maybe he was just a person who didn't cast shadows for some reason, or a tenant who somehow knew how to avoid the cameras. But in the back of my mind, I knew I didn't believe any of that. The floor was dark and quiet, every sound amplified by the silence. I made my way down the hallway, my flashlight casting long shadows along the walls. And that's when I saw him again at the far end, standing exactly where I'd seen him the first night. This time I didn't call out. I just stared, feeling a chill crawl up my spine as I noticed again that he had no shadow. He turned slowly, and for the first time, he looked right at me. His eyes were dark, expression unreadable, and he began to walk toward me, each step silent as though he floated rather than walked. I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot as he came closer. And then, just as he was a few feet away, he stopped. I looked down, and there it was, my shadow, stretching out before me. But his figure stood there, completely detached from the light, as if it refused to acknowledge him. It was like he was existing outside of reality, a blank spot that no light could touch. Without another thought, I turned and bolted down the stairwell, my heart racing. When I reached the lobby, I gasped for air, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was a trick of the light, but I knew better. The memory of his shadowless figure was burned into my mind. I went back to the security footage the next morning, hoping I'd find some proof, something to explain it all. But when I replayed the footage, it was blank. The entire night's recording was gone, as if the cameras had shut off the moment he appeared. I checked the other feeds, but it was the same. The footage from that night simply didn't exist. After that, I requested a transfer. I told my supervisor it was for personal reasons, that I needed a change, but deep down, I knew I was running away from something I couldn't explain. I never wanted to see that shadowless figure again, to feel that creeping dread that seemed to seep into the very air around him. In the weeks after I left, I started having dreams about the third floor. In the dreams, I would walk down the hallway, hearing footsteps behind me, feeling his gaze on the back of my neck. I would turn, but he was never there. Only a cold, empty hallway stretching out before me. And yet, I could always feel him, just out of sight, waiting for me to step back into his world. Even now, whenever I pass by the building, I can feel his presence, a lingering weight in the air. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I catch a glimpse of a shadowless figure in the corner of my eye, standing silently in a reflection, watching, waiting. The photos that see. As a photographer in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I'm always looking for the unusual, the hidden stories that most people overlook. I specialize in landscapes, capturing the haunting beauty of the desert and old adobe buildings. But last spring, I found myself drawn into a nightmare that still follows me, one photo at a time. It started innocently enough. An older man named Luis approached me after seeing my work displayed in a local gallery. He had the quiet intensity of someone who knew the world held secrets. Luis wanted me to photograph his house, though he didn't say why, only that he needed someone with an eye for the unusual. Intrigued, I accepted the job, thinking it would be an easy paycheck and maybe a chance to add some unique images to my portfolio. When I arrived at Luis's house, it was more unsettling than I expected. The place was tucked away on the edge of town, an old adobe structure that looked more like a relic than a home. Cracks lined the walls, vines climbed the faded paint, and the windows were caked in a layer of dust so thick I could barely see through them. When Luis opened the door, he looked almost relieved to see me, though there was a hint of something else: fear. Just take the pictures, he said quietly, motioning toward the rooms. I'll be in the other room if you need me. The house was filled with oddities, old relics, faded photographs, and strange trinkets that seemed out of place in an otherwise ordinary home. As I snapped shots of each room, I felt a growing sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me from just beyond the camera's view. I finished the shoot quickly, the strange atmosphere making me eager to leave. As I packed up, I glanced back to see Luis watching me from the hallway, his face tight with a look I couldn't quite place. I asked if there was anything specific he wanted in the photos, but he just shook his head and closed his eyes, as if he were already regretting calling me. That night, I went home and started developing the photos in my darkroom. The first few images were normal, just empty rooms with muted light filtering through the dusty windows. But then, as more photos developed, I noticed something strange. Faint shadows in the corners, almost like figures hiding along the edges of the frames. At first, I assumed it was a trick of the light or dust on the lens. But the more I examined the photos, the more it looked like faces. Their expressions were twisted in anguish, their eyes wide and desperate. It made no sense. I hadn't seen anything while I was there, and nothing in the house would explain such images. Convinced it was an error, I decided to return to Luis's house to retake the photos, hoping to clear things up. The next day I called Luis, who was hesitant but agreed to let me come back, though he warned me not to get too close. I arrived at his house again, this time in the early afternoon when the light was stronger. I examined each room carefully, checking for anything that might create strange shadows, but everything looked normal. The walls were bare, the windows empty. With Luis watching from the hallway, I took each shot meticulously, making sure nothing strange could get into the frame. That night, as I developed the new photos, my heart sank. The faces were still there, clearer than before, and unmistakably human. Their eyes seemed to follow me, filled with a desperate, pleading expression. Some were pressed against the windows, others were just faint shadows along the walls, and a few appeared to be reaching out, hands visible through the haze. I called Luis immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd seen. There was a long silence before he finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "They've found me," he whispered. Luis's words sent a chill through me. He explained that he'd once been involved in something he deeply regretted, something that left him haunted by lost souls. He wouldn't say more, only that he believed these souls had become bound to his house, lingering in the shadows, searching for a way out. Desperate to understand what was happening, I returned to his house the next day. Luis seemed even more on edge, his face gaunt, as though he hadn't slept in days. He showed me a room I hadn't seen before, a small, cramped space lined with old photographs, each one marked with strange symbols. He explained that these were people he had once known, people who had disappeared over the years. "It's like they're trapped here," he said, his voice trembling. "Like they can't move on." I spent hours talking with him, piecing together fragments of his story, though it made little sense. He spoke of rituals, lost memories, and shadows that moved on their own. He claimed he'd once tried to help these souls, but something had gone wrong, binding them to the house instead of setting them free. Before I left, I asked him why he'd called me to take the photos. His eyes darkened and he looked away. I thought maybe if someone else saw them, they could be freed. That night, I sat alone in my dark room, going over every photo, hoping to find something that could explain what was happening. As I looked closer, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Luis's face, faint and shadowed in the corner of one of the photos. His expression was one of horror, his mouth open in a silent scream, as though he were trapped within the image itself. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I tried to call him, but there was no answer. The following morning, I went back to his house, only to find it empty. The rooms were barren, stripped of everything, as though no one had lived there in years. Confused, I spoke to the neighbors, who claimed they hadn't seen anyone at the house for months. One elderly woman looked at me with pity, saying, "That place has been empty for years. It's been like that since old Luis vanished. Oh, must be over a decade now. A decade? My head spun as I tried to make sense of it. I had just spoken to him, been in his house, taken photos of his belongings. But the neighbors insisted, saying he'd disappeared without a trace, leaving only rumors and a haunted house in his wake. I returned to my studio, determined to find proof that he'd been there, that I hadn't imagined everything. But as I went through the photos, they began to change. The faces grew clearer, more distinct, each one twisted in fear. And among them, I saw Luis, his face becoming fainter with each photo, like he was slipping away, becoming one of the shadows. I deleted the photos from my camera, but they kept appearing, on my phone, on my computer, even printed and slipped under my door. Each time I deleted one, two more would show up, the faces clearer, their eyes more desperate. And every night as I lie awake in bed, I hear a faint whisper in the darkness. Help us before it's too late. I don't know how to stop it, or if it can even be stopped. But every time I close my eyes, I see those faces twisted in agony, watching, waiting, their silent pleas growing louder, filling my mind with shadows and whispers. And in every photo, Luis's face fades a little more, slipping deeper into the darkness, becoming one of them, trapped, as if his last hope lies with me, in a photograph that never should have been taken. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark and unsettling. If tonight's stories left you with chills, hit that like button and let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to hear where these stories reach. Don't forget to subscribe to stay close to the shadows, because there's always something lurking just around the corner. Until next time, stay safe and keep an eye on the darkness.